welcome everybody to Contemporary Issues class. Nice to have you here today. And I want to welcome any first-time visitors. I want to say hi to Mark Phillips, my friend from Men's Ministry. He's the chair of our Men's Ministry this year too. I'm glad to have him here. He's pickleball friends with our speaker, Ron Adams. And so we are pleased and excited to have Ron talk today about his book, The Inner Path, Calmness, Compassion, and Conversation in Turbulent Times. And so really he will be covering a lot of the things about spirituality and society and a lot of things that we always like talking about in this class. So, and I want to introduce his wife, Melinda, also, in case he doesn't. So.
I better, because this is our 13th anniversary of meeting.
Where'd you meet?
I will tell you, she was less impressed than I was.
I mean, who said 13 was an unlucky number?
Exactly. We met at Panera Bread in Jackson, Michigan, halfway between our two homes.
Wow.
We connected through eHarmony.
Oh.
Okay, go ahead, sorry.
Great. That's okay. It's all right.
Just a little plug.
Yes.
And now, go ahead. Did somebody have a question? Comment? Okay. Our usual announcements. Zoomers, please mute yourself in the lower left corner of your screen so we can keep the background noise down. And also, we are miking our speaker today for the first time to help get more even sound in this larger room that we're in. And so folks who have a hard time hearing, we've got a little amplifier out on our table. And if we get feedback, I'm going to adjust that, but bear with us on that today. And we are videotaping this for future playback too, so that your public notice about that. And any other announcements before we get going? Okay, Vicki.
I've been keeping track of Marilyn Gary, and Joe texted me last night and I didn't see it until this morning, but he said her kidneys are failing and she's in Skyridge Hospital. So just keep her in your prayers.
She's one of our
It's
class
really
members.
hard. Joe's having a hard time. So
Who's been on oxygen. You may remember Marilyn, a thin lady on oxygen and has had a bleeding ulcer, and she's in Skyridge. And Vicki and I visited her yesterday, and she's in palliative care now. So please keep.
The latest is that her kidneys are failing. So just
Yeah, it's like hospice care, just not defined as being within the last 6 months of life.
Pain management.
Pain management. Yeah. Sorry, Vicki, I didn't mean to cut you
No,
off.
that's okay. Just, just thoughts and prayers for them. This is a tough time.
Okay. Also, I put a few of these yellow flyers around the room too for classes. There are many new classes here at St. Andrews starting up in the spring here, including some scholar presentations and book studies, basics of Methodism, and then one by Rev Mark coming up called Open and Relational Theology, which always is well attended. That's in May. So if you want to go online and sign up for any of these, that's a way to get reminders and let us know how many people are coming. So lots of good things. Sure. You bet, Mike. Okay. All righty. Any other thoughts? I'm going to let Ron pretty much introduce himself, but we are glad to have Ron and Melinda as new members of our class from Michigan. And Ron, as I told you in email, is a former pastor and businessman. And so please welcome Ron Adams.
Thank you. I prefer to stand because otherwise I'll get too nervous sitting. So thank you so much. We've really been enjoying our time with this class and with St. Andrew. So thanks for allowing me to speak. I don't know if I can live up to the standard that Ron gives so many times in here. And obviously I don't have slides, so I have to use the whiteboard. In fact, I was thinking maybe you should offer a class on guys and gals who occasionally teach and they're retired and how to put together a slide. So I take that class. But anyway, yeah, we moved here from Michigan in September, and we live over by Guard Trail Road at 470 and the Eagle Bend Retirement Complex. And Mark, I'll tell you, Melinda's a better pickleball player than I am. So you don't want to come up against her. I guess we'll just launch right into this. It was about 24 years ago that I left the ministry, and through two basic factors. My thinking was changing. I grew up in a very kind of evangelical fundamentalist type church. So my father was a very loving pastor, always everybody dearly loved him.
For example, I guess.
And I went from, so my thinking was changing theologically, and so I really needed to move on. And I was also in a very troubled marriage that my father and mother were very loving and wonderful parents. They taught us very well around classic Christianity. I'm not sure they talked to us enough about not marrying your high school sweetheart necessarily. Some of them work out well, but anyway, we won't go into that. About 24 years ago, I left the ministry, and I had a really interesting ministry journey when I was in there. I was actually approved by the Bishop of North Indiana, Woody White, to be a Methodist youth minister at one time. And then I moved on to another opportunity. But I was actually part of 3 different denominations, ordained in the first one, and then my ordination was recognized in 2 others. So I had this wider spectrum, all the way from starting out in very kind of evangelical fundamentalist denomination, and then I moved to Anabaptism, which is the progressive Mennonites. And I learned about the peace movement and just the kind of the connection between the Mennonites and the Amish, and lived in an Amish community, Mennonite Amish community for 20 years. And learned all about that. It was just a wonderful experience. And then when I finally left the ministry, because of pressures in my long-term but troubled marriage, I bought a photography studio and became a wedding photographer. I had a good mentor, became wedding, high school seniors, children, all that kind of stuff. And then after about 12 years of that, I sold it, moved to Michigan, and became an IT client relations guy. So you don't have to know any technology, you just have to know how to get along with people. And then bring the tech guy with you. So I always said, if you can get through the first 2 questions, hi, how you doing? Why are you here? Then turn it over to the technical guy. But just make sure you bring the donuts and all that good stuff. I am here at St. Andrews directly.
What this is an example of Republican overreach on an issue that the American people have long moved past. The American people as a whole, are completely accepting of who people love and how they live their lives. And these hard policies about saying certain youth can't play sports and certain people aren't allowed in certain places, or micromanaging what restroom people use and mandating what they do.
There we go. Somebody
Okay,
muted
I got it.
themselves.
Somebody wasn't muted. Okay.
Okay. Well, I was afraid I was gonna put people to sleep, but I actually just turned that guy on to TV. Anyway, it was back in 2000, leading up to the election in 2016, and I was online and looking at some articles, and I came across this article, 5 ways to find common ground this election season. And we were living in Michigan, and we had purchased a house out here, but we were renting it for a year or leading up to that time. And really liked the article, and I was collecting material for the book I was going to write. And so I Googled the name of the author of the article, and it happened to be Rev. Mark Feldmar.
Oh.
Yeah, and so I started connecting with him. I quoted him in my book at one place, and because I knew I'd get one sale then. And so he was very, very kind. I took his online course with the theologian from Claremont, and I think saw some of you in there. So anyway, that's why I'm here, and it's been a really nice journey. So I wrote this book for 4 major goals. I put a bunch of stuff up here because I want to just give you some snippets of things and then turn it to you to some questions. And then we'll just take it whatever direction you go. So obviously I brought materials for whatever question you ask me related to the subject. First of all, the book is about how to begin a pilgrimage that leads to calmness, compassion, and activism in turbulent times. So the big question is, do you think we're in turbulent times? I drove into King Super the other day over on Smoky Hill Road and had my truck at that time. And so I drove in and I'm out a long way from the store, you know, just at the end of the line. And there was a truck that had pulled into a parking spot. The door was open and there was a truck facing me in the middle of the row coming up here, street, whatever it is, alley. And his door was open and both of these gentlemen were out of their trucks. This is a King Super on Smoky Hill. And they both had their fist up. And I had a front row seat. And it happened so quickly, I didn't have time to record with my phone or anything. I wished I would have. But the guy that got out of the truck that was in the middle of the street made short order of the guy that came out of the other truck and laid him out on the blacktop, just like that. And so then he hops back in his truck and takes off. So I tried to do the Good Samaritan thing, and after I knew he was gone, got out and helped the guy because it looked like he had knocked him out. And there was a little blood splattered on there, but he wasn't gushing or anything. And so I helped him up and asked him if he needed a ride, and he refused. And I said, what happened? And he said, well, we were out on the highway and some sort of road rage thing happened. The guy followed me into the parking lot. And so they were both idiots because even he got out of his truck and he didn't know what he was up against. And this guy was obviously much more able to do street fighting. And so it pointed, it's an extreme example, but the term that I've come up with is we're living in a culture right now of ambient anxiety. You know, the word ambient, which is, you know, background noise in a mall, you know, nothing specific, but you just hear this noise, background light in a room where there's not a specific spotlight, but it's just the average light. So in photography, we talked about ambient light. I believe our culture, and I'm supported by many, many authors and researchers, and even this morning's New York Times talk about this underlying anxiety and anger that is at an elevated level in our culture. So let's just quickly list some reasons, and then I'll go to the goal number 2, 3, 4, and then we'll. What are some reasons why we have this ambient anxiety and anger at an elevated level? Just throw them out. There's no wrong answers.
Cultural chaos.
Cultural chaos.
Disconnection from others.
Disconnection from others.
Family difficulties.
Family difficulties.
Political upheavals.
Political upheaval. Boy, you guys are
Economic challenges.
economic challenges, the
Ukraine.
gaps between the haves and have. Who said what?
Ukraine.
Ukraine, yes.
Climate change.
Climate change. All of these things are creating this ambient anxiety, and COVID and the lockdown and all this kind of thing, even though it helped me write the book, for most people, for many people, I should say, it created this higher level of anxiety and disconnection that I think has really affected us as a culture. And so it doesn't take much to get something started like a King Super or a McDonald's drive-through or any number of situations in our culture. And I began to hear from friends in Battle Creek, Michigan, home of Tony the Tiger, by the way, that they didn't know how to talk to some of their family members and some of their acquaintances that they knew were on the other side of a political or religious divide. And so goal number 2 is to offer tools for conversation that we don't always think of. In fact, there's 3 words I forgot to put up here, all these words that I'm putting up here. light. If I forget one, you'll freeze. Or fight. Yeah, thank you. I knew you would know. So, and we'll get into this if you want to, because I've got some interesting materials and these are, I'm giving you tidbits from the book, but these are our 3 common choices. When you're with the guy that I call Uncle Joe at Thanksgiving, and he's just a little overboard in his conversation, you either leave the room, you get really quiet, or you have a knockdown drag out with Uncle Joe. None of them are good options. And so we want to talk about what are some tools that go beyond those 3 common cultural responses to conversation. One gentleman who wrote a book, a guy named Arthur Brooks, wrote a book called Love Your Enemies, and it's listed in the book. And he says, it's not less conversation we need, it's better conversation. And isn't that true? But the problem is, we oftentimes don't have the tools. We don't know how to have those better conversations. Goal number 3 of my book was to look at cultural analysis. What is at the core of all of the polarization? I know we've talked about it. Ron has had a session a few weeks ago, I think, on nationalism, which touched on these issues. And what I'd like to do, and what I've done in my book, and I'm willing to give a handout and talk about this a little bit if you want to, is what is a evolutionary culture development perspective on why we are so separated. And it makes sense to me. It's just one of many ways of looking at culture, and I'd be glad to talk about that. And then the 4th goal of this book was to highlight some fantastic resources. So, sometimes I think in a church setting, there are individuals who say, well, it's all about theology, or it's all about the Bible or whatever, but I really get my connection to God through nature. And let me tell you, I found a book, resources. I found a book that is amazing. It's got wonderful, and I'll pass this around. It's got wonderful photos of this guy, his artwork. And if I could find one, well, there's one on the cover. He goes out into nature and he collects things that have fallen in a basket. And then he creates these wonderful mandalas, circular artistic pieces. And then he leaves them for nature to do what it will. People walk over, animals, whatever. He photographs them. And then, but in addition to that, he's developed a 6 or 7 step spiritual process that speaks to him. I think his background is Jewish, but the words in this book are just amazing. So don't take the time to read the book, but you can write down the title if you want. But this is the kind of stuff he did. I think he's in the Northwest, so they have color up there. I'll pass this around so we can talk about any of these things. Here's a couple things I want to highlight. The target audience for my book is really not this class, though I think the book is written to anybody who will pick it up. It's written to Christians, non-Christians, atheists, agnostics. It follows the path that Rev Mark introduces our services with. This church is for those who believe, or skeptics, or heretics, or if you believe anything at all. So I try to hit that target audience because, there's enough books that are targeted to Christians, but I don't think there's enough of spiritual dimension books that are targeted to non-Christians. The book is also written for Republicans and Democrats. So I try really hard in this book when I give illustrations of how to do something better based upon my research, to give an illustration from the conservative side and an illustration from the more liberal side. And I try to, so I'm open to the criticism. My mother, who's a she's 92. My father passed away quite a few years ago, but my mother is still pretty strong in her faith, and she has a few questions about my book. But it's okay. You know, she still loves me and I still love her. And then, so yeah, you'd have to see how that works out when you, if you read the book. So the target audience are all kinds of individuals. I take in the first section having to do with a pilgrimage. It's a 7-step spiritual process to go inward and to lead you toward calmness, compassion. And I put compassion and activism because quite often compassion is, as far as talking about it, the more conservative religious people, they really focus a lot on there. If you go to some of the big mega churches, it is hard to to do everything that they do. You know, like I knew one church in Goshen, Indiana, that was running, 3,000 people on a weekend, and they had everybody bring brand new winter coats one day and bring them all up to the altar, and they gave them away. One time they had people give their shoes right off their feet. It was a summer. And then, they had this big pile of shoes. Well, it's quite impressive to those who like to do that. But then activism is kind of at the heart of a lot of more liberal congregations. We really want to address systemic problems in our culture. And St. Andrew really does a nice job of both. That's really what's cool about St. Andrew. The pilgrimage is a 7-step process. And the reason, and it has to be kind of done in order. And the process comes from ancient spiritual wisdom writers. So it could be Thomas Merton, it could be Richard Rohr. How many of you know Richard Rohr? We're going to stop by his library next Monday, a week from Monday, in Albuquerque. I should, not his library, but his bookstore. So you take some of the wisdom writings from down through the centuries, which most of them are religious. I tried to strip away most of the religious language. And so then the steps I put in thoroughly modern terms. So the first 4 steps have to do with what I call focus, study. It's all around meditation, or you can call it centering prayer. And it's the kind of prayer where you're not asking God for something. Or if you're not a Christian, you're not even referencing God, but you're slowing down and you're reflecting. And this is for beginning meditation students, not for advanced meditation students. Study. Some people think if I just go meditate for 10 minutes a day, I've done it, But if you never read, if you never look deeper into some issues, it's hard for your mind to grow. Another phrase I like that I highlight in my book is called aha moments. You know what an aha moment is.
Light bulb.
All of you, yes, a light bulb goes off. And we routinely talk about it in terms of technology, inventions, those kinds of things. When's the last time you had an aha moment of the soul? One of my pet peeves when I was in the ministry, and I was only in the ministry about 12 years, but was people don't come with any questions. They might come with hurts. We all have hurts. We all have disappointments. But most Christian people never come to church with a question. Why do we believe this? Why do we do this? Why do we do that? And because we've all been taught kind of the basics of Christianity. If you never have any questions, you can never have an aha moment of the soul. And so I try to put a few things in the book that hopefully you've never heard before. And I know when I've talked with Rev Mark about this, he's all into that. He likes inquisitive. It doesn't trouble him. So
Ron,
yes.
do you want to take questions as you're speaking?
Yes, I do.
Okay.
So we can go any direction you want here. Have I generated any questions at all at this point?
Did you have an aha moment in your spiritual journey?
I have had I live for aha moments. And let me just show you, you know, if you think about people writing about religion, you would think, well, it's not that big of a subject. This is called The Religion of Tomorrow. And look at how big this book is.
Wow.
Now, this is not a book for the faint of heart, but contained within this guy's analysis of culture and religion are some nuggets of information that have never dawned upon us. And the reason is because of this cultural evolutionary development that I really buy into. It's a way of looking at how culture moves and how we're at a stage in development where if we keep going to the next level, and we could go down or we could go up, we will be in a very interesting stage in which for the first time in human history, we will actually appreciate everything that came before us. And by that, I mean, we'll appreciate the virtues of everything that came before us. So when you're in a conversation, let me just skip to, and please interrupt me at any time. When we're in a conversation with somebody and they are from a different, let's say a different political perspective. If you're at this evolutionary stage that is beginning to emerge, you will look for the virtues in their position and not look for the pathologies. Every position has a virtue and every position has a pathology. Let me give you an example from both sides. Don't get offended if the first example I give you happens to be the side you're on. When Hillary Clinton said, use the phrase basket of deplorables, she was illustrating a pathology of understanding. And when you focus on a pathology of your opponent, you actually, in a little way, drag the culture down. When Trump referred to all immigrants from Mexico as rapists and killers and that kind of thing, he was dragging the culture down by focusing on occasional pathologies. But if you focus in your conversation on your virtues, you know, then you can have a conversation because your virtues will probably be in agreement. It's when you get to certain policies and especially degrading the other side because you want to win the argument that you get into trouble. And which is another key point of one of these tools. We shouldn't be trying to win arguments. When we're in discussion, we should be trying to get to know the person. We should be looking at their virtues. What people do in conversation is we all have a virtue, we all have a pathology, and we all look at the other person's pathology. And they're looking at our pathology. And we need to look at each other's virtues. And if we do that, then you can have a conversation. So, questions?
Ron,
Yes.
Grant Clark here. We didn't come in this morning, but
Why?
Because, you know, hey, who knows? Oh, who knows? I don't. Anyway, Lola and I, we just said, okay, let's watch church on TV, and then we'll do this. So last night we were watching a movie on Netflix. It's called The Social Dilemma. And in that movie, it was talking about anxiety and all of the things that you're talking about with the problems, like two people getting out of pickups and knocking each other around. It started approximately in the years 2010 to 2011. And at that time, that is when Facebook and TikTok and all of these things started. And it has increased our anxiety levels and our levels of depression, especially in children, a tremendous amount. And today we are sitting here with that problem. And it's a problem that is going to continue to get worse until something happens. It talks about governmental controls. It talks about the business of the Facebook people controlling us. And those are some things that I'm not sure these 7 steps that you're talking about will be listened to by those people. They have their own agenda, and that's where they're going. Just a comment.
Yes, let me make one observation and appreciate your comment. Steve McIntosh is a philosopher who lives in Boulder. He's still alive. We've had conversations on his porch. Through writing the book, in fact, he endorses it. He says, we all have to become better versions of ourselves. What does that mean? It means, number one, we're not going to solve this cultural problem by waiting for a leader to come along that's going to have all the answers. We're going to solve this cultural problem by learning how to talk with one another across divides, not fleeing. Now, it doesn't work when you're talking with an obnoxious individual, the guy that got out of his truck with his fist up. I'm not having the conversation with him. But most people want to just have peace. They want to, and I think they're looking for a deeper relationship among their friendships, their family. And if you can set the stage right, you can have a conversation. And as these conversations bubble up through a culture, what happens? Then your leaders pick up on that, and then they suddenly want to lead in those areas. It's not going to happen from Washington, D.C. It's going to happen by millions of people living at a higher level than we obviously live right now. Yes, and then remind me to get to Socrates, okay? There he is right there. Okay.
Do you have any tips for doing what you're suggesting, which is very noteworthy? Not to be preoccupied with the pathology, but the virtues of the individual. Do you have any tips on how one centers themselves in such a way that you aren't led into confirmation bias, or the ego or self doesn't allow you to hear what the other person is saying? Do you have any practical tips on how one can center oneself, particularly in a contentious situation, where you have those two extremes going at each other? Do you have any practical suggestions?
Well, I think so. It's not a comprehensive list, but they're in part 3 of the book when we talk about conversations. And it starts with thinking about Socrates. I picked this up down the mountain from what do they call that? The Acropolis in Athens. I'll pass it around. This is Socrates, and it says Socrates in Greek, 470 BC. And I want to ask you, before I answer your question, how many people know, first of all, what the relationship is between Socrates, Aristotle, and Plato? And secondly is, what was Socrates' #1 contribution to our modern, ideally our modern thinking?
Socratic.
What's that?
Socratic question.
Question and answer. Okay, that's part of it.
Teacher and mentor.
Teacher, mentor, that's part of it. It's still not, from my perspective, the #1 thing, but that's okay. It's all Socratic. Yes. Humility. That's getting closer. So here's the relationship between the 3 famous philosophers. Socrates never wrote anything down. There's no writings of Socrates. His student was Plato. Plato tells us about Socrates and the death of Socrates. How many remember the story of his death? That he was forced to drink the hemlock poison, and the story goes that he was actually smiling and in good spirits while all of his followers were just in despair. And he went to his death peacefully. And then the student of Plato was Aristotle. So the way you remember this is like a spa. Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, spa. And so Socrates was teaching, he was kind of like a wandering wise man through the city of Athens. And he was teaching the young, arrogant young men, the rich men, because the women were not allowed to learn at that point. So he was teaching these young students about life and wisdom and everything else. And the number one thing he taught them was the beginning of wisdom is when you recognize how little you know. Now, how many of us really buy that? Science has said, you got to know this, you got to know that. This is a fact. This is all true.
Einstein said that too. The more I know, the more I realize there is that I don't know.
That's right. So do we do that in our faith? Again, looking for that aha moment of the faith. And then I got to get to the answer you wanted. Yes, Vicki.
I have written in one of my Bibles, a pastor one time said that when you become enlightened, which is what you said about that book, when you become enlightened about something, then it's your responsibility to use that enlightenment because you will never not know that again. And so to me, when just the fact that you said what you said about looking at the virtue as opposed to the pathology, I will not forget that. Just hearing that
Thank
will
you.
make me not forget that. So in conversation with somebody again from here on, I'll be aware of the fact that I want to go after the pathology, but yet the right thing to do is go after the virtue. So I like the fact that we become enlightened about things, because once we are enlightened, then we never, we know that.
It's an evolutionary process that if we open our minds to it and our lives to it, it can lead us in some really exciting things. You want me to answer your question first?
Yeah, but can I just
Yes.
comment on the Vicky's comment? I remember what Jerry Butler said last week,
That's all right.
that one of the characteristics of being a disciple is to be a student.
Yes.
So I think another way of saying that is the beginner's mind, or if one perceives themselves as a student, they're open to inquiry.
Absolutely.
So that gets it, what you're saying about humility.
Absolutely.
Because
What scientific discovery would have ever been made if no scientist ever doubted what he already knew? None.
You need the personality trait of openness all your life. And there's another, the Roman Senator Seneca had another parallel saying that many might have attained to wisdom had they not assumed they already possessed it.
Absolutely. That's a great one. I may have to write that one down for my next book. So let me give you some quick tools, and they're all open for additional questioning, because I'll just give you just a quick snippet. And I think some of them go against our common understanding. First of all, develop calmness. So go on a pilgrimage. So the guy that wrote that big book says there's 4 steps in any pilgrimage. If you follow it all the way through, it's waking up, growing up, cleaning up, and showing up. Waking up is enlightenment. Growing up is learning how to look at religion and politics and life in ways other than your childhood understandings. Cleaning up is looking at your shadow side. We all have a shadow side. It's those things that we don't even see within ourselves that we usually bury so deeply. And it really helps to look at it. And showing up is your compassion and activism. It's kind of a neat little thing. So first, develop calmness. Agree to talk without disparaging the values of another person. So you almost have to have an agreement. I talk in the book about meeting a young guy at a family wedding that I was participating in, and I could tell he was from the opposite side politically that I was. And so what I did was I used number 3, critique your own position first. And I began my conversation with this young man by telling him what I really disliked about my own position, what really bugged me. So in other words, I picked out the pathology of my group and I shared it with him. And you know what that did? It lowered his defenses. because I wasn't looking at his pathology. I was sharing, you know, admitting what side I was on, but sharing what drove me crazy about my own people. So that's a technique. No attempt at convincing. Conversations are about affirming and learning. And you know, how many one-on-one conversations do you have that's actually going to affect the trajectory of our country? Zero.
Vote.
So why do you have to win that conversation?
Go vote.
Yeah, go vote.
There you go.
You can have a little one, and that's a private thing. That's not a conversation. It's a private thing. So in your conversations, you don't have to win that. It's better to make a friend, be a friend, do all that stuff. Partial truth, that is a big one. So that comes out of Socrates, you know. Partial truth means within every position, there is an element of truth. When I was studying in seminary, we studied the heresies, the traditional historical heresies that, you know, people got burned at the stake for way back when. And there was a partial truth in every heresy, a little kernel of truth. That's why it gained traction, because there was something that connected the people. And then this diagram, or this thing that I sent around here, speaks directly to recognizing that our world views are different. So let's talk about that just for a moment. This is and maybe later we can take a picture of this and put it online. So if you look at right in the middle of the page, there is traditional, modern, and postmodern. Those three categories are the three main categories that are part of our culture today in America. So if you, a real simple way to think about it is, if you think of your grandparents, most of them were traditional. They were very much into rules, roles, discipline, kind of a more serious faith in God and fundamental. I hate to use the word fundamentalist, but you know, it was all, with some of them, more about morality and guilt, delay the gratification, social conservatives. That way of looking at the world is about 5,000 years old. And there's some very good things about that. So again, look at the virtues. I love my grandparents. They were very loving and kind people. I have a different understanding of certain things, but there's nothing wrong with their approach. The modernists are the people within the last, since the Enlightenment, that have really been enamored with science, the new technology, whatever's coming down the pike. Individualism, capitalism grew out of that, materialism, achievement is highly valued, secularism, risk-taking, and then postmodernism comes out of, it was older than since the 60s, but in the 60s, it really propelled forward. And it has to do with all of the real modern things like pluralism, feminism, political progressives, civil rights, egalitarianism, environmentalism. Now, it's possible to have a foot in one and a foot in the other. Keep that in mind. Because as we grow, everything is on a spectrum, but it's helpful to look at these three categories. So if you encounter someone who politically is a traditionalist and you are a postmodernist, you're going to talk right past each other. So that's where you need to really go to try to find their virtues. So in order to kind of stimulate your thinking on this, let me give you the potential pathologies of these three worldviews. So let's start with postmodern, maybe the more liberal, and then I'll tell you what happens when you go to integral. Postmoderns oftentimes are somewhat narcissistic. They deny hierarchies oftentimes. Now, don't forget, this is on a spectrum, so it's nothing is hard and fast, but these are just general descriptions of some of these. They dislike modernism oftentimes. In other words, one of the things that is true of a lot of postmodern is they question objective truth. Oh boy. Everything's relative. The statement, your truth is your truth, my truth is my truth. That's a postmodern statement. Well, it sounds good. I mean, it's great. Okay. And it helped us as a culture get to certain things. It helped us with environmentalism and feminism and all of these issues that are kind of growing and developing right now. But it also has its limits. If there is no objective truth, then how do you respect all the basic institutions of society, like the church, the law, politics? How do you have a basic respect? So what are the modernist pathologies? And again, these descriptions, there can be more than what I'm listing. I'm just giving you a few. They can be unscrupulous. It's all about the science, no matter what. Don't talk about the ethics. Don't talk about the morals. This is the way it is. Think of nuclear weapons, maybe.
Or clone.
Or cloning, whatever, lots of stuff. Like they can be exploitive. They can be selfish. Nihilism, materialism is a big one. Our whole culture is just consumed by materialism. And if materialism ever gets a slap on the wrist, we tend to get depressed, can't spend as much. And then a traditional worldview, a rigid intolerance, dogmatism, chauvinism, and sometimes a denial of science. So you can see where all of us, no matter where we are on the spectrum, have pathologies. Now, if that doesn't answer some questions, but make sure I talk about Tesla before we're done here. But any more questions right now?
I've got a question. A little bit of question, a little bit of comment. When I look on, this is interesting. When I look on this spectrum, I say Jesus is post-integral. He's at the top. And yet he was dealing with a world when he came on the scene that was in traditional amber, probably heavily, maybe some movement toward modernism, that's talk about Socrates, things like that. But how do you, and I think right now, I think the folks that are following sort of this traditional tradition tend to think Jesus is down here in the traditional amber section, but to me, obviously, he's post-integral. So how do you view that? And how do you recognize, if you agree with me on that, let's say, how do you reconcile the fact that some people are operating in Jesus's name and say they're following Jesus's message, but in reality aren't even on the spectrum to meet up with Jesus?
So if you read a lot of the resources that are listed in my book, you'll find individuals who have a very wonderful, warm feeling about the Jesus story. Then you'll find individuals who think that that's been overdone and they question different aspects, like some of the miracles and things like that. And you'll find atheists, a whole spectrum of people with understandings of Jesus. Here's the point, and I think this answers your question in a way that you don't expect. Did I put it up here? Okay. I wrote it on the back of this one paper, so I get it right. It's about the process, not perfection. And it's about the journey, not the destination. It really is. Your spiritual life is not about the afterlife. It's not about any particular destination. It's about, are you on a journey or are you stuck? And so it doesn't matter whether I have a more, let's use the word liberal conservative. If I have a more liberal academic understanding of the life of Jesus, and you have a more, let's say, evangelical understanding of the life of Jesus, and in a future class, we could get into that. It doesn't matter. What matters is our relationship. And if we're both on a journey. So wherever you're at on this spectrum, if you're willing to grow and move along, you're okay. My grandparents, okay, so I had three sets of grandparents. My dad was raised in a foster family, so I was lucky. I had three sets. But the one guy was a hardcore fundamentalist missionary to Haiti, And when my mother got her, instead of wearing dresses, she got her first pair of slacks. He called them monkey outfits or something, I don't know. Good old Grandpa Adams, he was a hardcore guy. He was harsh. He was very harsh. We didn't have much of a relationship. My granddad Cordell was loving and kind and just, he was on a journey. And they both had their plates, but so I'm not answering your question specifically about my belief system, but I am answering in general. So integral, when you get to the first level above postmodernism, and I don't want to use the word above because it's just an evolutionary development. And these evolutionary developments, by the way, happen in science. They happen in the universe. And what the integral people are saying is we need to recognize they happen within us internally. So for instance, your 2-year-old has a very tribal understanding that his God is parents, his or her God is parents. What they say is he has no, or she has no ability to understand deeper nuances. And then as they grow older, they follow right up these stages. Now, these stages are not anything new. You can go to, if any of you are psychologists, Lawrence Kohlberg, self-actualization, all of these are figured into these kinds of things. It's what the integral people have done, is studied all the world's religions, all the world's psychology, sciences and everything, and tried to see where are the commonalities and what are we looking at? And it's all an evolutionary process. Yes, Ron.
Do you think more people, as they grow older, become more rigid and closed-minded? Or do you think the opposite occurs, where as people gain experience and age, they open up to more ways of thinking about things? I tend to think it's the latter, but I may be wrong. Your opinion?
My opinion is that in general, it is the latter if there isn't any extenuating circumstance that hampers that development. And currently in our culture, politically, we have those kinds of things where we've become very rigid in our beliefs on both sides. So on the one extreme, let's talk about the left extreme. You hear about the term wokeness. And we could talk about that in a way that is very extreme. And that's actually what a lot of the conservatives are criticizing, is the extreme wokeness, not the good, beautiful, just normal developmental. The other side, we know what those are. It's the extreme characteristics that were embodied in Mr. Trump. So, yeah. Now, religiously, we've been taught about original sin. Let me just throw this out there. Do you know that there are some religious movements that talk about original goodness? That it is experiences and educational deficiencies and psychological deficiencies and everything else that cause the evil in the world, but there's a core of goodness. And actually, the Christian faith actually believes that too. The spark of God, we believe that. So the focus, in my way of thinking, ought to be there's a original goodness that's contained in every human being. I like that thought.
Ron, we've got about 5 minutes left, and if there's
Tesla.
anything you want, okay, go ahead.
Elon Musk gives me an illustration that makes us feel confident in those areas that are not scientific, but are matters of faith. So if you're more conservative in your faith and you believe fervently in every part of the conservative doctrine, or if you're more liberal, you can take heart because Elon Musk has a certain faith. You know what his faith is? He believes fervently that we are part the whole universe and every human being is part of a computer simulation. And he actually funds a company to try to research how to break out of this computer. So it's the Matrix, okay? Elon Musk believes that fervently. Now, that's not science yet. So what I say is, and I'll take this to the Muslims too. The Muslims believe that Muhammad rose into heaven on the back of a horse, and I think the horse's name was Barak. All right? Now, sounds funny to Christians. We believe that Elijah rose into heaven, right? On the top of Mount whatever. Not so funny now, is it?
I have a comment.
So the point is, it's all okay when you're, as long as you admit it's areas of faith. Go ahead.
I love that, and I'm a big fan of the idea of a simulation and thinking that through. I think it's fascinating. But you know, one thing I found is if you think about the world and our what we think is objective reality is nothing but a simulation, essentially God's simulation, it makes it quite easy now to reconcile the Bible with science.
Mhm.
It's so easy to do that if you say you're living in a simulation, because then anything is possible, just like God's video game.
That's exactly right.
People appear, disappear, elevate, towers of fire, parting red seas, because it's just programming code, right?
Or
So
just study.
I just thought that's a curiosity
Yeah.
that comes out of him, or not him. I mean, a lot of people in multiverses and simulation theory.
Yeah.
But if you look at it that way, all of a sudden, everything becomes very easy to reconcile
Yeah.
with traditional religious belief.
Yeah, so the point is, when you encounter someone who has a way out, far out belief, that's okay, you know? Nothing's gonna change by trying to convince them that they're wrong. Elon Musk does it. He can do it. I can do it. Any last minute thoughts or questions?
Have you read Road Less Traveled by Scott Penn?
Oh, yeah, many, many years ago. Yeah,
And then Celebration of Discipline by Richard Foster. He talks about that.
yes, yes. Oh, yeah, meditation, I think, is the key beginning point. And let me just point this, the 7-step journey ends in activism. If you move activism to the front of the line before you do the other things, what happens?
Anarchy.
Anger.
Anger.
So it's close. A guy named Paul Knitter, who's this Catholic theologian, wrote a book called Without Buddha, I Could Not Be a Christian.
Wow.
And he says he was an activist in Central America way back in the 60s or 70s, whenever all that was happening. And he says, we went in there thinking we knew all the answers.
Yeah.
And we quickly learned that if you don't love your enemy, you can't have a conversation with them.
Well, Ron, I think that's especially interesting now because of the Douglas County School Board
And then
controversy we have going on. Folks on the left and the right there both think they have Jesus with them and their view and their activism, and they're not talking to each other. We've heard, of course, that that's why this controversy erupted. One side didn't consult the other on the firing of the superintendent. And thank you for focusing on how to talk to people on other sides of the aisle here, because obviously we have a hard time doing that.
I do
Gary.
have a practical question.
Yes.
So if everything's okay and we all just accept that everybody has their own beliefs and that's fine, what about when it turns to harmfulness towards one another?
Okay, so I'm glad you asked that question. So like I said, the guy that got out of the truck,
Mhm.
I'm not engaging with him.
No,
Okay, because even if I engage with him, I can't change
right,
absolutely obnoxious.
right.
But here's the final statement of, I think, where a Christian should go. And it comes from the 14th century, Julian of Norwich, who grew up,
Mhm.
about 50% of her population died of a pandemic. And she was kind of a mystic at that time. And her famous quote is, all shall be well and all shall be well. and all manner of things shall be well. At some point, we have to say, it's okay if we don't win. As a Christian,
Mhm.
as a spiritual person, if you're a spiritual atheist, which you can be, it's okay.
Do we
Well-
not have a responsibility to prevent harm?
You have a responsibility for compassion and activism,
Uh-huh.
but you have to realize that if you move them out of order and you don't do the calming
Mhm.
and the introspection and reflection and study, that you're going to have to live with your own anger, your own enthusiasm that goes too far quite often, and then the backlash. And if you're willing to do that, and some people have stood in the gap and did that, you know, the Barrington brothers went and pounded on the heads of nuclear weapons and got sent to jail. But they raised a consciousness. A few people can do that, but the average person can't do that. I mean, are you gonna go break into a nuclear silo and, did Ron do that?
It made me think of Archbishop Romero in
Yes.
El Salvador. When he became Archbishop of in San Salvador, he said, he asked one of the people in the church, he said, what must I do to, be a good bishop? And they said, get out into the community, get out into the barrios and the rural areas and talk to the people. Stop just having tea with the ladies, because that's what he had done. Most of his ministry had been having these, tea parties with ladies in the church. And they're saying, get out there. And that began 3 years of his movement to empower rural indigenous people and stop what was happening with the military, which was being supported by the US.
One thing to your, the calmness, compassion, and activism, Carrie, I was thinking, I have a friend who I can't have conversations with because of our differences in the roads we've taken. And I finally had to come to her and say, don't worry about me, I'm good with God. And I feel like as long as my relationship is good this way, then my relationships are gonna be good this way. And so, and that I think is where you're coming from with the calmness and the study is, if this is good, then I can be good here. And I can accept other people that way too, I think, but that helped me with her, so.
I'm just thinking on a much more practical
Yes.
level.
So
yes.
another,
Who refuse to acknowledge that they could kill somebody else when they have COVID and they don't care.
so
That's
another,
very practical.
a couple other practical,
No, it's not.
a couple other practical things might be, never try to convince a whole group. You're in trouble
Right.
unless you've got the authority to do that. And secondly, I think we need to watch way less news because we breathlessly wait for our side to win the next battle.
Yeah, that's.
And it destroys our soul. It really does.
We have to wrap up. I wish we could take longer, but thank you so much, Ron. Would you close us in a short prayer, would you mind?
Sure,
With some of your concepts?
sure. Thank you for friends, for relationships. Thank you for growth, the ability to think, to read, to reflect. Keep us calm. Keep us working toward peace. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Ron. Ron has some books up here also, if you'd like to come in, get one. Thank you.
Bye.
Take care, everybody. See you next week. Bye-bye. Thank you, good.
I'm familiar with Romero.